everyone, my name's Arjun, and today I'm going to be showing all of you 12 dynamic chess gambits. Let's get on to the first one. So, the first of the 12 dynamic chess gambits I'm going to be showing you guys is called the Kings Gambit. And this is one of the most well-known gambits in chess, and it begins like this. E4, E5, and now white plays the move F4. The move F4, its point is that if black tries to take the pawn, for example, if black takes, then what white wants to do is he wants to just continue his development normally, bringing his pieces out all to normal squares. But the thing is, now that the pawn's no longer on E5, white will be able to play the move D4 eventually. So that's the whole point of the King's Gambit, to try and get a big center. And if black doesn't know how to play against it, it can be a very useful weapon. So clearly white would want to play the move D4 right now, just to gain control of the center. But the issue with that is that black will play the move Queen to H4. Since the F-pawn's already moved, this line is vulnerable. And so now white's king will have to move to the square E2. And this is clearly going to be bad for him, because obviously you would like to castle in the opening. So before white plays D4, they would want to play knight F3 to protect the square H4. Now there are many good options for black, and one of the most common is to play the move G5. The idea of the move G5 is to protect this F4 pawn, because if white got his way, he would play the moves D4, knight C3, and bishop takes F4, and his position would be wonderful. But this move G5 doesn't make things so easy for white, and so now white has to come up with something to do. Probably the best move for white here is to play H4, trying to undermine this pawn chain that black has come up with. Firstly, if black tries to play the move H6 to protect his pawn chain, then after H takes G5, H takes G5, he loses his rook. So H6 is not a good move. If instead F6 is played, things are nearly as bad, because instead of H takes G5, white can play the move knight takes G5. And the idea behind this is that once black takes back, white can play the move Queen to H5, forcing king to E7, only legal move. And now white can take this pawn with check. Notice that his queen is skewered, so black will either have to play knight to F6, blocking the check, or king to E8, where his queen is still protected. If the move king to E8 is played, then white can play the move Queen to E5, which is a pretty easy way of winning, but an even better move is to play Queen to H5 yet again. And now after king to E7, only legal move, Queen to E5 is a fork on the king and rook, and white will win. Now just one more thing that can happen here. If black plays the move knight to F6, then what white can do is he can simply play the move E5, attacking this pinned knight, and white will get his piece back next move. So after those inferior moves, H6 and F6, we come to the last two sensible moves that black has. One of them is to play G4, which is probably the best move for him. After the move G4, white has a few different places he can move his knight. Clearly, it's not good to go to G1, because it's bad to retreat your pieces generally, so white should play the move knight to E5. Now this G4 pawn is being double attacked, and there are a few options for black. One option is he can try to play the move D6, just continuing development, but after knight takes G4, things are pretty good for white. Black has doubled isolated pawns on this open file right here, and although white's knight on G4 is misplaced, that is pretty much made up for by the fact that these pawns are so weak. So white's position is fine here. Instead, if black tries to play the move Queen to E7, aiming to take this E4 pawn next move after white takes here, that doesn't really help black either, because what white can do is he can just play the move D4, protecting the knight, and now if the knight is kicked away, white can just take the pawn on G4. And now if queen takes E4, white can just play queen to E2. And though he's down a pawn, these two pawns are doubled and isolated, and they will likely fall soon. So white is doing completely fine here as well. The final line in this variation I'd like to take a look at is, instead of the move Queen to E7 on move 5, black can try the move H5, which is a very aggressive move, aiming to keep this G4 pawn. This move, however, is not too good either for black, because white can play the move Bishop C4. This move double attacks the F7 pawn, and since F7 and F2 as well tend to be the weakest pawns in the opening, this is pretty bad for black. One way he can try and defend the pawn is to play the move knight h6, but after knight h6, white can simply play the move d4. And now, after this f4 pawn is likely to fall after virtually any move that black plays. And after white takes it, he'll have the threat of bishop takes h6, removing the defender of this f7 pawn. This is an example of just how the game could continue. Black can try and get the best for his pawn, but things won't end up being too good for him. And white's position is slightly better in here. The second gambit I'd like to talk about is called the Danish Gambit. And in my opinion, this gambit can be even more aggressive than the King's Gambit. It starts off normally enough e4, e5, and now white plays the slightly uncommon move, d4. This is called the center game, and black will normally take back with the e-pawn. Now, a few options for white include queen takes d4, simply recapturing the pawn, knight to f3, aiming to recapture with the knight next move, and the move that we're going to be looking at, c3. This move gambits a pawn, and it's not the most common move in this position. People tend to prefer queen takes d4 and knight f3, but after this, black has a few choices. The best move is just to accept the gambit with d takes c3, and if white plays the move knight takes c3, we're in what's called the Cochrane Gambit. However, we're not talking about the Cochrane Gambit in this video, we're talking about the Danish Gambit. And in the Danish Gambit, white sacrifices a second pawn with the move bishop to c4. This move gets out the bishop, aims at f7, and now after the most common move, c takes b2, white can take back with the bishop, and now he is down 2 pawns, but he has 2 bishops out that are aimed right at the black king side. Here there are a few good options for black, and one of the most common moves here is to play the move d6. And d6 is just a pretty safe move in this position. Black already knows that his position is not very good, because although he is better here, the thing is, although he's up 2 pawns, he's very behind in development. So it seems like it would be a good idea to play safely. After the move d6, white should just continue development normally with knight to f3. And now there are a few options for black. Probably a good move here would be to play knight c6, but before we look at that, I'd just like to show a little trap. If black tries to play bishop to g4, then white can play the move bishop takes f7. And now, if king takes f7, white can play the move knight to e5, preparing to recapture on g4 next. Note that the pawn can't take because the queen will hang. So after the move king e8, white can take back the bishop, and he will be better because black has lost his right to castle. However, the move bishop to g4 is not likely to be played, so it's better to also be prepared for other lines, such as knight to c6. Here, white should just castle, and now black has a few options. If black tries to play a move like, for example, knight to f6, then white can play the move knight to g5, which, although it looks pretty simple, it's actually very good, and white is much better in this position. White is now double attacking this f7 pawn with the knight and bishop, and the only way for black to even attempt to defend it is to play bishop e6. But unfortunately for him, after knight takes e6, f takes, bishop e6, white will be better, just because now black's king is even more open than it was earlier. White is also ahead in development, and on top of that, white is now only down 1 pawn. So if black tries to play overly safe, then bad things can happen. And the best way for black to continue is to play bishop e6. And the thing that this does is it blocks this bishop line on f7. So now white can continue with a move like knight to d2, protecting his bishop. And now after a move like knight f6, white can just play bishop takes e6, f takes e6. And now the game will continue after a move like knight g5. Now black can play a move like e5. And now the ideas for both sides are pretty simple. White can play a move like queen b3, which double attacks this f7 pawn, this b7 pawn, and the f7 square, threatening checkmate. And now black can play a move like queen to d7, and now white can play something like f4, aiming to open up this file. Here, white's position is pretty aggressive, and although he is down 2 pawns, the game is going to be very competitive. So, instead of the move d6, black can try other moves, such as a move like bishop to b4. And this is not a very common move. d6 is definitely more common than this. but white should just play a move like knight to c3, getting his pieces out. Already, there is another trap that black can fall into. If he tries to play the move d6, aiming to get this bishop out to one of these squares, then white already can win some material by playing the move queen to b3. The idea behind this move is this b4 bishop is being attacked now, and the queen and bishop have formed what is called a battery on the f7 pawn. If black tries to play the move knight c6, protecting the bishop, white can play the move bishop takes f7, winning a pawn, and getting rid of black's right to castle. Instead, if the move bishop takes c3 is played, white can play bishop takes c3 back. And now, after a move like knight f6, protecting the g7 pawn, bishop takes f7, and white has a pretty big advantage. So one last move that I'd like to take a look at is actually the most common move here, and that is the move d5, giving back one of the pawns to try and get some extra development. White should now take back with the bishop, and you may notice already that this move has a pretty big threat associated with it. If black just plays a move like c6, very obvious, aiming to get rid of this bishop so that the queens can be traded, well, white has a stunning tactic, and I'll try and give you a moment to find it. The tactic that white has in this position is he can play the move bishop takes f7. And now the king can't take because of queen takes d8. So if king e7 is played, white can just play bishop to a3, forcing king takes f7, after which queen d8 will win a queen. So the best way for black to continue is with knight f6, and at first glance you may think that it falls into the same trap, right? Bishop takes f7. If king e7, then maybe something like bishop a3, for example. But things aren't actually as good for white here as they seem. In this position, can you find out the way that black survives this attack? I'll give you a moment to find it. The way that black survives this is he finds a counter tactic with the move king takes f7. White will take the queen, of course, and he's feeling very excited about his prospects. But now black plays the discovered check, bishop to b4. Now, after this move, white will have to do something like, for example, queen to d2. Note that if the king moves, then the queen falls for free. And after white plays a move like queen to d2, bishop takes d2, and now knight takes d2, the material situation is now equal. Black has 2 extra pawns on the queen side that are balanced by white's 2 extra pawns on the king side. Black has this light squared bishop compared to white's dark squared bishop, and the position is roughly equal here because material is equal and both sides have roughly equal development. So this is just an example of a middle game that the Danish Gambit can continue into. The third gambit I'm going to be showing is also a very wild and aggressive gambit, and it's called the Evans Gambit. This gambit begins the same way as the other two: e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, and now bishop c5. From here, the most common moves are moves like d3, c3, and knight c3, but instead, white plays the move b4, which at first sight looks very, very strange. Why would white give up a pawn for free, you ask? Well, after the move bishop takes b4, white plays the move c3, and all of a sudden, his purpose becomes clear. After the bishop moves away, to any of these squares really, white will play the move d4, aiming to get a big center. After the move bishop a5, which is the most common, white can play d4. Now, after e takes d4, you'll notice that since this pawn is pinned, c takes d4 is no longer a possibility. So white will just castle. Now c takes d4 is white's threat, and after that, he will have a big center. There are a few different options for black in this position. One of them is to play the move d takes c3, trying to get a second pawn. And from here, black is actually up 3 entire pawns. However, even if this pawn falls, since it's quite weak, black will still be up 2 pawns. White should continue by playing the move queen to b3, and this double attacks the f7 pawn, which surprisingly is somewhat hard to defend. Black has a few options as to how he can defend it. One of them is to play the move queen to f6. After queen f6, white can play the move bishop g5, trying to move the queen away. The queen has to go to g6 to continue protecting this pawn. White can just take back his c3 pawn now, only down 2 pawns at the moment. After bishop takes c3, queen takes c3. Now black can play the move knight f6, simply getting his pieces out. White can play e5, aiming to push the knight away, and after move like knight to e4, white can play queen e3, and after castles and a move like bishop f4, the game will continue. It's true that white is down 2 pawns, but the position is actually pretty close to equal here, and that's just because since this knight is on e4, you'll notice that all of its squares it can move to are defended. So the knight can become a target for white after a move like, for example, bishop to d3. And the way that white can continue is by attacking this knight and aiming to stop the advance of this d-pawn. This bishop is actually almost trapped on c8 because the d-pawn is kind of blocked by this e5 pawn and the bishop. So that is how you can play after the move d takes c3, trying to get an extra pawn, but there are other options. The most common move is knight g to e7, and the reason that this is played more often than knight f6 is because after the move bishop a3, it's very difficult for black to get castled. Knight f6 is another option we'll be taking a look at later. So knight g to e7 is played, and now white can play c takes d4, getting back the pawn. Now, if black tries to just castle, then the way that white will continue is by playing d5. After the move d5, black really only has 2 options for his knight. One is knight to b4, but after knight to b4, white can play the move queen a4, attacking this bishop. The bishop cannot move because then the knight will hang. If the move c6 is played to protect the bishop, then white can play the move d6, attacking the knight, and if the knight moves away, then white can play the move bishop g5, attacking the queen. And black's pieces are very tied up on the queen side, so white is better here. Instead, black can also play the move knight to b8. And the idea of this is that he doesn't want to get his knight trapped on b4. Now white should play the move d6, which blocks the d-pawn from advancing. And if c takes d6, white can play bishop to a3, trying to get this pawn back next move. And after, for example, a move like knight to c6, white can play the move bishop takes d6. And now, since this knight is pinned, white is actually not doing badly because he's only down 1 pawn here, but this bishop is going to have a really difficult time getting out. The only way really is to play b6 and bishop b7, but that blocks this bishop on a5 from getting in the game. So you can see that black is going to have to spend a few more moves sorting out his pieces. And meanwhile, white has very easy development of all of his remaining pieces. A third alternative for black in this original position, after castles, is to play the move knight to f6. After knight f6, white is going to play the move e5, attacking the knight. The knight clearly doesn't want to go to g8, so its remaining options are to go to e4, g4, and h5. If knight to g4 is played, then white can just play bishop to g5. And now if f6 after e takes, and if knight takes here, rook e1, and if a move like knight e7, then white can just play bishop f6, g takes f6, and now a move like even, for example, knight to e5, aiming to play queen h5. And if after e takes f6, if the move g takes f6 is played, white can just play bishop f4. And now this knight is sort of stranded on g4. So things are not looking too good for black in this variation. Clearly, if knight h5 is played, g4 can be played, trapping the knight. Or sorry, no, not g4. g4 is actually not a very good move just because of the move d5. And now if e takes d6, bishop to g4. So don't play the move g4. You should instead try the move knight to g5. And this attacks the knight and double attacks the f7 pawn. So white is better. Because of this, an unexpected fourth alternative pops up, which is the move d5, attacking this bishop while the knight is being attacked. The way that white should continue to play this is he should play e takes f6, getting the knight, g takes c4, taking the bishop, f takes g7, rook g8, and now white can play the move rook e1. And from here, black should block with the bishop, and now white can play bishop g5, attacking the queen, queen g5, and now things are actually pretty strange here because after a move like knight to d2, if black tries and takes back this rook, white can play the move knight to e4, attacking this weak f6 square, because if the knight gets to f6, the king and queen will be in a fork. So from here, the position is very wild, and there are many alternatives, which I'm not going to be covering in this lecture. But if you do choose to play the Evans Gambit, make sure you know all of these lines. The fourth gambit I'm going to be showing is the Staunton Gambit. And the Staunton Gambit begins with the move d4. The Staunton Gambit occurs when black plays the Dutch defense, which is d4, f5. Now, white should play the move e4, which initiates the Staunton Gambit. After the move f takes e4, white should play knight to c3, attacking this e4 pawn. Already, black can kind of fall into a trap. If he tries to play the move d5, hanging onto this pawn, you can try and find the tactic here for white. It's pretty simple. I'll give you a few seconds. The move that white can play to win some material is queen to h5 check. And now, regardless of what move is played, white will take back the pawn. And from this position, this e4 pawn is going to be very weak, and the c7 pawn is already under attack, so white is better. Because of that, if black wants to continue normally, he should play knight to f6, simply protecting this pawn. Now white plays the move bishop to g5, and now, once again, if black tries to protect his pawn with d5, bishop takes f6, e takes f6, queen to h5 will win the pawn back. So from here, white's threat is clear to play bishop takes f6, knight takes e4, and the best thing for black to do is actually just to ignore the threat, really. He could play a move like knight to c6, after which white should just play the move d5, attacking the knight. And from here, there are a few options for black. The best one by far is to play the move knight e5, and if he plays the move knight a5, for example, b4 will be played, trapping it. Knight to b8 is obviously not going to be a good move, and that's just because it's bad to retreat your pieces to your original squares. Knight to b4, after the move a3, knight a6, black's knight is pretty misplaced on a6. And just one sample line after knight e5, white can play the move queen to d4, and after knight f7, white could just take back here if he wanted, although in this position it just loses because of this. So it's best for white to just protect the bishop with, for example, knight to h3, and then take the pawn back later. Instead, what black can do, and this is also a very common move, is to play e6, just continuing development. And after this line, white should just play knight takes e4, getting back the pawn. If knight takes, bishop d8 wins. And so instead, after knight e4, black should break the pin with bishop e7, takes c3, blunting this bishop's diagonal, castles, bishop to d3, and the position is very normal here. So white should be happy with how the opening has gone if this line comes to be true. The fifth gambit I'm going to show is another gambit starting with d4, and it's also another one for white. It starts off with d4, d5, e4, which is not the Staunton Gambit, sorry. It's called the Blackmar-Diemer Gambit. Now, black will normally take on e4, but just something you should know. If you choose to play this, you should also have a response to e6, the French defense, or c6, which transposes into a Carlsbad. From here, after d takes, white can play knight to c3, aiming to take back this pawn. Black should just play knight f6, protecting it. And now here's where the real gambit part of this opening initiates, and that's with the move f3, offering black to take the pawn. Black should take it, and now after knight takes f3, white is down a pawn. You'll notice that his f-pawn and e-pawn are gone, compared to just black's d-pawn, but he is ahead in development, and his position may be easier to play later on. Now there are a few options for how black can play. Knight to c6 is one option, and bishop to g4 is another option. If bishop to g4 is played, white should play h3, attacking it. And now, if bishop h5, which is the most obvious move here, white should just play g4, pushing the bishop back once again. Bishop g6, and now white can play knight e5, threatening to trade it off. After a move like e6, white can trade pieces and play something like bishop to g2. And now his position is pretty good, because not only does white have the bishop pair, this b7 pawn is going to be pretty annoying to defend for black. And what white can do is he can just develop his pieces all to normal squares. And note that his rook will also have an open file when it gets developed. So instead of bishop to g4, another good option is to play knight to c6, which black can do. From here, white should play the move bishop to b5, attacking the knight. Now, black might just continue developing with e6, and now from here, white can castle, and now after a move like bishop b7, white should play a move like, for example, bishop takes c6, and after b takes, black has these doubled isolated pawns, which white will be targeting. White can play the move knight e5, attacking this pawn. Black will probably play the move bishop to b7, for example, and now white can just continue his development. And from here, you'll notice that this bishop on b7 is sort of being blocked by the c6 pawn, making it less useful. And meanwhile, white's knights here are in very good positions. And really, white's only bad piece will be his bishop on e3, compared to black's bishop on b7. So from here, white will have a comfortable game, where he can try and attack the c6 pawn in as many ways as possible. The sixth gambit I have prepared is called the Cochrane Gambit, and this one is another e4 gambit for white. It starts off with the move e4, e5, knight f3, and knight f6. So that's the Petrov defense. White plays the move knight e5, taking the pawn, and black continues on the main line with the move d6. Now, most of the time, white will play the move knight to f3, but to play the Cochrane Gambit, he should play knight takes f7, which at first glance seems kind of a ridiculous move, because he's just giving away a knight. But after king takes f7, it becomes clear what white's intent was. Since the e5 pawn had already been taken by white, sacrificing for the f7 pawn means that white has two pawns, specifically these two pawns, for black's extra knight, which in general is not a terrible material balance for the two pawns. Now, from here, white should continue with the move d4, simply gaining control of the center. And already, black can fall into a trap with the move knight takes e4. If this is played, white will win back some material with the move queen to h5. If g6 is played, queen to d5 forks the knight. If king to e7 is played, then white can just play queen to e2. And if the move d5 is played, then in this exact instance, bishop g5 will win the queen. And if something else is done, like for example king f7, then the knight will fall. And from here, if the move king to g8 is played, queen d5 will be checkmate in 2. So clearly knight takes e4 is not black's best bet. Black should instead play a move like, for example, knight to c6, continuing development. Now white can protect the e4 pawn with knight c3. Black might play bishop e7, developing, and from here, after a move like bishop to c4, check, king f8, and now you'll notice that black's king is almost stuck in the center. It can't really go to the king side because of this very annoying bishop on c4. And now, white's plans are actually going to be pretty simple. White can play castles, and if black just continues developing passively, white will play f4, e5. And if just black does nothing, of course, black should not play these exact moves. Well, if this happens, of course, he'll lose a piece. And you'll notice that it's very difficult to defend against white's upcoming attack. So this line can be very pleasant for white if he plays it properly. Now, instead of playing knight to c6, the most common move is to play c5, which tries to counter in the center. From here, white should play the move knight to c3, just getting another piece out, protecting the pawn. And now, if black plays the move c takes d4, white can just play the move bishop to c4. And now, if the move king e8 is played, after queen to d4, knight c6, queen d1, white's ideas are to once again castle, play f4, and play e5. And once again, it's not too easy to stop these ideas, and the position is roughly equal here. Instead here, it should be noted that if d5 is played, trying to double attack both of these pieces, white can just take back with the knight. So d5 is an okay move, but white has a way to refute it. Instead of the move c5, one last option for black is to try the move queen to e7. And after queen e7, the idea of this is simple. Since knight to e4 in the original position did not work, why not take it with the queen instead? White should play the move knight to c3, protecting it. Now, if the move knight to e4 is played once again, then white has the exact same idea he had in the previous situation. After the move g6, queen to d5 will win a piece. So from here, if black just tries to continue developing with like knight c6, then white can play bishop to c4. And this position might begin to seem familiar right now for good reason. After a move like king e8, white will castle, and the plan is, you might have guessed it, f4, e5, f takes e5. And after that, white will have very strong pieces, and black's king will not be safe. So this line can be very good for white. The sixth gambit I have to show is another one that occurs in e4, and this one actually occurs in the Sicilian Defense. Here, white plays a very rare move, and that move is b4. The idea of b4 is pretty simple when you think about it. If c takes b4, white will eventually want to play the move d4 and gain control of the big center. So after the move c takes b4, instead of playing d4 immediately, white plays the move a3. Now there are a few options for black. Either he can accept the gambit immediately or play the move d5. And since d5 is a more common move, I'm going to be looking at that one first. If the move d5 is played, now what white should do is he should take on d5 with the pawn, and now queen takes d5. And make sure, if you play this gambit, never to play a takes b4 here. This actually happened in the US Championship many years ago, where this exact position was reached, and after the move queen e5, white resigned because of this tactic. So make sure that after e takes d5, you do not play a takes b4. And now white should just play the move d4, protecting against this square. Now, black will often play b takes a3, just taking the pawn. And now, after this, white can just play knight takes a3, and both sides will just develop normally, really. Knight to f3, e6, c4, queen a5, bishop d2, queen to d8, and bishop d3. And in this position, this is as far as I'll go in this line, you'll notice that white has all of his minor pieces out, and all of them, except for this bishop on d2 really, will be on pretty good squares. Meanwhile, black only has one piece out, and this bishop on d7 is not a very good piece either. So the position is roughly equal here, just because black's material counters white's extra development. So instead of playing b takes a3 in this exact position, another option is to play knight to c6. Now after knight c6, white should play knight f3, protecting the pawn. Now there are a few options here. One of them is to play the move bishop to g4. And now after the move c4, which is what white should do, if b takes c3, knight takes c3, queen a5, this is what could happen. White can play bishop to d2. And now you'll notice that there is this possibility for a discovered attack on the queen. But if you look at the squares white's knight has access to, none of them will really do any damage to the queen. So black should just continue developing normally, move like e6. Now white can play rook b1, attacking this b7 pawn, queen c7, d5, opening up the center since black's king is still stuck there. E takes, knight takes, queen d7, bishop c4. And the position is very interesting here because although he is down a pawn, white will be able to castle in one move and then play the move rook to e1 next. So white's position is pretty good here, in my opinion. And the last line I'd like to take a look at in the wing gambit is what can happen if, instead of the move d5, black accepts the gambit immediately with b takes a3. White should just play bishop takes a3, and black may develop with a move like knight to c6. White can play d4, gaining control of the center, queen to a5, and now he can play a move like c3, blocking the check. If black plays the move knight to f6, then here what white should do is he can play a move like, for example, bishop to d3. Except the issue with this is that knight takes d4 will win a pawn. So white should definitely not play that. Instead, a move like queen d3 would be better, because knight takes d4 is no longer a threat. Now from here, black might play a move like d5, aiming to counter in the center. White can play e5, attacking this knight. After a move like knight e4, white can attack the knight a bit, and then after a few more moves, both sides will just continue their development. And from here, the ideas for both sides are pretty simple. Once again, black will fianchetto his bishop in a few moves and castle kingside. White, on the other hand, will aim to use this active rook on this file. He will also castle, and the squares that white will be trying to get control of are c5, a very powerful square, and an f4, f5 plan is also not going to be out of the question. These are just some of the lines that can occur if you choose to play the wing gambit. Gambit number 8 for today is called the Latvian Gambit, and this is the first gambit I'm going to be showing that black can play. This gambit starts off with e4, e5, white plays knight f3, and now black plays the very rare move, and perhaps slightly dubious, f5, which initiates the Latvian Gambit. Now, white has a choice of two different free pawns to take, and let's look at the move e takes f5 first. If e takes f5 is played, black should play the move e4, attacking the knight. After the move e4, white has a few options. If knight to e5 is played, then there's this really complex line that can occur after a move like knight to f6, bishop to e2, and now the move d6. And from here, there's very complicated lines that occur after the move bishop to h5. I won't be going through all of them, but I'll just give you a taste of what can occur. After bishop takes h5, checking the king, black should play king to e7, and now white can try to fork the king and queen, like this. Now, black will play the move queen to e8, and once white takes the rook, black can take the bishop. And from here, black's king is not going to be very safe. White is up in exchange, but this knight on h8 is probably not going to survive. And I'm not going to be going through all of these lines right here, because if you want to play the Latvian Gambit, you should just research these ones on your own. So instead, just something else that you should be aware of, if white plays the move knight to c4, black can just play bishop takes f5. And from here, his position is completely fine. If bishop to h5, black can just take and play the move g6. So one more line in the e takes f5 variation. If white chooses to play knight to d4 instead, black can play the move queen to f6. This attacks the knight, and now if the move c3 is played to protect it, black can just play knight to c6. And after takes, queen e2, black can just play bishop takes f5, protecting this pawn, and now black will either castle queenside or develop these pieces and castle kingside. The other possible line for white in the Latvian Gambit is, instead of playing e takes f5, to play the move knight takes e5. From here, there are a few options for black. One of them is to play the move queen to f6. After queen to f6, white can play the move d4, aiming to keep the knight on e5. Black can play d6, followed by knight c4, and now black can just take the pawn back on e4. if black tries knight c3, white can play, if white tries knight to c3, black can play the move queen to g6, protecting the pawn. And now, after a move like f3, trying to get rid of this pawn, the game will just continue like this. And after queen to f6, another possible option is for white to play the move knight to c4. And this knight to c4 line isn't too complex. Black can just play f takes e4, and now if a move like, for example, knight c3 is played, black can just let the pawn go after a move like c6, allowing this possible variation. And, sorry, no, not that move, queen to h5. And things will be very complicated in this line. The ninth gambit I'm going to be showing is one of the best, in my opinion, for the side that plays it. It occurs for black once again, and it starts off in the Scandinavian defense, e4, d5. After e takes d5, black plays the move knight to f6, aiming to recapture the pawn with the knight. Now, most of the time, white will play a move like d4, for example, but in order to play the Icelandic Gambit, white should play the move c4. Here, the two best moves for black are to play e6 or c6, both of which gambit a pawn. The Icelandic Gambit is the move 3e6. And now, the vast majority of the time, white will recapture. Now, black should recapture with the bishop. And now, there are many different lines that white can play, but the one I'm going to be focusing on is pawn to d4. So now, black should play the move bishop to b4 check. And there are a few different ways for white to block the check. If bishop d2 is played, then black should just take the bishop, queen takes, and now queen e7, aiming to discover check the king. If a move like queen e2 is played, then black can just play the move knight to c6. And if d5, is it a pawn fork? Well, not exactly. Black can play knight to d4, and if a move like queen to d2 is played, bishop f5 check, followed by something like this, will win a lot of material. So from here, if this line occurs, white should just play queen to e3, after which, once again, knight to c6 could be played, and if d5, then black can play knight to g4, attacking the queen. If here is played, then the pawn will fall. So that is one example of what can happen if bishop d2 is played. Instead, another option is to play the move knight to c3, blocking a check a different way. Now, here, black should play the move knight to e4, attacking this pinned knight. And from here, there are several ways that white can try to defend this. One of these ways is to play the move queen to b3. But the issue with that is that black can just play knight to c6, protecting the bishop. Once again, if d5 is played, knight to d4 will be very powerful, because in this line, black can just do this, for example. And his position is very, very good here. Instead of playing queen to b3, white can also try to play the move knight to e2 to protect it. But from here, black should just play the move bishop takes c4, getting the pawn back. If white tries the move queen to c2, then what black can do is he can just play knight takes c3, b takes c3, and queen takes d4. Note that this pawn is pinned both ways, because this can happen, and this is impossible because of this pin. And the last way I'm going to be showing to try and protect it is to play the move bishop to d2, after which the move queen takes d4 can be played. If knight takes e4, then you can just play queen takes e4, and after a move like knight e2, a good option is just to play bishop takes d2. And black has his pawn back. The c4 pawn is very weak, and white is going to have a hard time castling because of how hard it is to get this bishop out. So the Icelandic Gambit is a very good gambit for black, and I would definitely recommend that you play it if given the opportunity. Gambit number 10 is possibly the most widely played out of all these gambits, and you may have heard of it before. It's called the Benko Gambit. It's another one for black, beginning with the move d4. After d4, knight f6, c4, black plays the move c5 here. So the move d takes c5 here, which might be the first thing you think of, is not very good just because after e6, black will soon get the pawn back. Instead, nearly all of the time, white plays the move d5. And from here, the Benko Gambit begins with the move b5. Another common option is to play the move e6, which is the B20 defense. But anyways, after b5, now white will almost always take the pawn, and here black sacrifices another pawn with the move a6. After b takes a6, what black does is he plays g6, aiming to fianchetto this bishop, and eventually recapture this pawn. So white can just play the move knight to c3, getting the knight out. Black can just play the move, for example, bishop to g7, but the issue with playing this line is that after the move, like, for example, e4, then after a move like castles and e5, black has to be prepared to play in this variation. So I'm not really going to be showing this line. Instead, I'd recommend you just play the move bishop takes a6, where e4 is not likely to be played just because of this connection. So instead, after bishop takes a6, the move g3 is more common, aiming to fianchetto the bishop. Black should now play the move d6, stopping this d-pawn in its tracks. And after bishop g2, both sides can fianchetto their bishops, and both sides can castle. And from here, it may not look like black has much in exchange for the pawn, because after all, he is still down the pawn. Black has no lead in development at all, pretty much, and it seems as though white's position is solid enough, right? Well, that's true, but also not true in a way. After move knight b to d7, white might play the move rook to b1, aiming to play b4 in the near future. Black can play queen a5, and after a move like bishop d2, white can play rook f to b8. And here is where the real power of the Benko Gambit begins to become apparent. Since this a-pawn is white's extra pawn, an a-pawn is generally one of the least valuable pawns on the board, and since black's two rooks are right here, aiming down this line, these two pawns are very hard to make use of, and white can barely advance them at all, really. That's pretty much the furthest white can advance his pawns at the moment. Meanwhile, black has this extremely powerful bishop, and this d5 pawn will be a target for a very long time, which black can aim at with both his knights and his bishop. So, for example, a way that the game can continue is like this. And from here, white might play the move b3 and knight to b6. And it's very difficult for white to actually make anything happen really on the queen side, just because of how strong black's rooks are. And though it may not look like it, the Benko Gambit can actually be a very serious weapon on the queen side, because if even one of white's two pawns here falls, then the other pawn will end up being very, very weak. And black will actually have a big advantage, really, if that ever happens. So the 11th gambit I'm going to be talking about is called the Schliemann Gambit. And this is another one that occurs for black. It comes in the Ruy Lopez, e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5. And here, black plays the third most common move, which kind of surprises you it's so high up. He plays the move f5, sacrificing a pawn. From here, white has a few different options. White can try e takes f5, bishop takes c6, or knight to c3, for example. If e takes f5, the most obvious move is played. Black plays the move e4. From here, white has a few options. The best move is to try queen e2, pinning this pawn, after which black can play queen e7. Note that the knight doesn't really have any good squares to move to now, so if white tries knight g1, things are pretty bad, because after the move knight to d4, this bishop and this queen are not looking too good. Instead, if this position happens, white should just play bishop takes c6, d takes c6, knight to d4. And now white is doing okay, but the easiest way for black to continue is to just play a move like knight to f6. Eventually, black will be able to get this pawn back just because it's so weak. Instead, in this position, after the move e takes f5, if white tries to play bishop takes c6, black can just play d takes c6, and after a move like knight e5, bishop f5 can be played safely. And black is doing pretty well, just because material is now equal, black has the bishop pair, and white's knight on e5 is kind of out of position. A second option that white can play after the move f5 is knight c3, which is the most common move, just protecting the pawn. If this happens, black is in no real danger, because after f takes e4, knight takes e4, black can just play knight f6. And from here, there are a few options. If black tries knight takes f6, if white tries knight f6, black can just play queen takes f6. And this pawn on e5 is solid. Black will have good development. And most importantly, perhaps, his king will be safe, which is not something you can say after every gambit. Instead, from here, another option for white is to play the move queen to e2, targeting this e5 pawn. From here, black should play the move d5, attacking this knight. And now, if knight takes f6, black can just play d takes f6. And as you can see with these arrows, black's two center pawns will have good squares, and his king will be safe castled queenside. The final option I'll be looking at in this gambit is the move bishop takes c6, after which black should play d takes c6, recapturing. The idea of bishop takes c6 in general is that white wants to play knight takes e5, which this may remind you of the Latvian Gambit. Once again, white has two different options of pawns to take in pretty much the exact same situation, except for differences on the queen side. From here, if white has played this, he's likely intending to play knight takes e5, after which black should play the move queen to d4. From here, white should play knight to f3. Note that if queen to h5 is attempted, after g6, knight takes, aiming to try and get this rook. If g takes, this queen is protecting it. So white has achieved nothing. Instead, from here, black can try knight to f3, after which white can play queen takes e4. And if queen e2, black can just take. And the position is solid because black has the bishop pair, and though he has these double pawns here, his position will be pretty good. That is the Schliemann Gambit for you. The final gambit I'm going to be looking at is called the Englund Gambit, and this one is also considered to be somewhat dubious, though it can be very powerful if used properly. It starts off with d4, and here the move e5 is played, sacrificing a pawn on move 1. White plays d takes e5, and now black plays the move knight to c6, aiming to recapture this pawn. White plays the move knight to f3, getting the knight out and protecting the pawn. Now, black can play the move queen to e7, double attacking this pawn. From here, there are a few options for white, and the most common is to play the move bishop f4. And from here, one way that black can continue is by trying to go for this trap with queen to b4. White will likely play the move bishop to d2, after which black can try queen takes b2. If the move bishop to c3 is played, white has this tactic with black has this tactic, with bishop to b4. And now, from here, if black tries to take the queen, if white tries to take the queen, you'll notice that it's illegal because of this pin. If black takes this bishop, then in this exact instance, knight takes b4 is a bit stronger, just because of this double attack, and black would be winning. But unfortunately, black should not go for this line, and that's just because if white plays the move knight to c3, and black attempts bishop b4, things are pretty good for white here. Just because after the move knight to d5, white will have a lot of threats. So instead of playing the move queen to b4, black should sacrifice his pawn for good here with the move d6. And now, after the move e takes d6, accepting the gambit, black can play queen f6, double attacking. Now, white will likely play the move queen c1, protecting both of these pieces. And now black should take back on d6, after which takes and takes will occur. And now white is slightly better here just because he's up a pawn, but the game is far from over. And that's just because after a position like this pawn on e4 is not a very strong pawn. Black will have many, many ways of attacking it. For example, after rook to e1, bishop to g4 is a possibility. And rook to d8 is where the other rook will likely go, with these strong rooks on open files. So after a move like bishop d3, black can just play rook e8, and the game will continue from here. Thank you for watching my video about 12 different opening gambits. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you all next time.